Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. So this video is for all of you newbies to the PCMR out there. We are going to be discussing the ins and outs of RGB lighting. Now I only plan on covering the basics in this video and I want to try and touch on it as quickly as possible, so I apologize if I skip out on any of the more specific details, but absolutely hit me up in the comments below. I want to get a discussion going with some of you that are newer to this and maybe I can answer some more of your questions. Anyway, getting into types of RGB. There's three of them that proliferate out there. Standard RGB, which means a combination of intensities of red, green, and blue lighting saturating with each other to create the desired color. RGBW, which is the exact same thing as RGB, only with a secondary LED on the connector that's dedicated just to white light. And then there's ARGB, or addressable RGB, or sometimes it's even referred to as digital LEDs. These are basically the LEDs that are capable of being recognized as individual components on a strand rather than all having to change their colors at the same time. That basically means that you can get all these really cool lighting effects like what these Antec Prism fans do. Now, each type of RGB lighting has its own unique type of connector. My motherboard happens to have all three of them, so I'll throw up some footage on the screen for you guys to see what each of these looks like physically, and I'll have diagrams on the screen just to the side of me over here. The first kind of connection type is a 4-pin connector, and on my motherboard, the Gigabyte X470 AORUS Gaming 7 Wi-Fi, it's located just to the bottom left of the CPU socket. This is a 4-pin header. Again, it runs off a 12-volt feed and has 3 additional pins, one each for red, green, and blue signal. Now, if you're ever confused about the pinout of a specific pin connector that you're trying to hook up to, be sure to reference your motherboard manual or your user's guide for your RGB lighting kit. That should give you all the information that you need. Also, remember, if you're ever trying to figure out which section of the connector is your 5-volt or 12-volt power, all you have to do is look at it and see where the arrow is pointing. That's going to tell you where your voltage goes in from that pin, so you know exactly how to plug it in. Anyway, moving on, we also have a 5-pin connector. This is for the RGBW lighting solutions that you would hook into this motherboard. Again, as before, it's the exact same thing as a standard RGB 5050 header. Main difference being there is an additional pin to address the white LED on the strip. Now, the nice thing about this particular header is, especially in the case of my motherboard, it can be used to run just another RGB cable if you don't have an RGBW equipped solution. And they do supply an adapter in this instance to do one or the other. Then there's your 3-pin header for addressable RGBs or digital LEDs, however they're referenced. In the case of this motherboard, they're referenced as digital LEDs. And it uses a 3-pin header, but it's not the same kind of 3-pin header that other motherboards like ASUS, for example, might use. In this case, it is 3 pins, but it's not using a standard 4-pin connector like what other digital RGB solutions will use. In this instance, all 3 of the pins are clustered close together, which means you can't plug a digital or addressable component directly into that header. Now, thankfully, in the case of the Antec Prism fans and in the case of this particular motherboard, an adapter is supplied for this header, so if you do have anything that needs to plug in there, it'll work just fine with that adapter in place. Now, as far as my setup is concerned, I have RGB going on from a couple of different manufacturers. I've got Antec, I've got Gigabyte, I've got Corsair, I've got MSI. And then on my desk, I've even got some Rosewill going on. So obviously, these aren't all going to talk to each other through the same software interface. So unfortunately, and this will probably be the case for many of you out there, if you really want RGB lighting, sometimes you may have to use multiple forms of software. Now, I want to talk about this for a little bit because there's 3 different bits of software that I use to control all of the RGB lighting, or I should say that I can use. Really, I only use 2 of them, but I want to sort of go over them really quickly just to show you guys sort of what's available out there. First off, we'll talk about the Rosewill software that they implemented for this RGB 80 10 keyless keyboard. In short, it's super clunky. It's really hard to read this damn thing. And when it uploads the information that you're using to adjust the keyboard, be it lighting or macro adjustment or whatever, it takes for freaking ever to upload anything. I mean, it's painfully slow. Now, what is nice about that is these changes that you made are saved to the device. So once you get everything dialed in the way you want it, you can get rid of the Rosewill software. You won't need it to run the lighting or your macros or anything for the keyboard anymore. But that's assuming you can even get a color dialed in, because color selection in this software was not great at all. You were sort of clicking and guesstimating where pixels were landing and hoping you were clicking on the color that you wanted to get. Now, this software was out there during Rosewill's earlier entries into RGB illumination. I'm sure that's improved at this point, or at least I would hope it's improved for their current product line. But again, this is an older keyboard, and software has definitely come a long way since the days of that really clunky, just bad interface. Bringing us into the two bits of modern software that I use, which is MSI Mystic Light and AORUS RGB Fusion. Now, as far as Mystic Light and RGB Fusion are concerned, they both have really smooth feeling interfaces to them, and they give you a lot of customization options in terms of the types of lighting and color palettes that you can use on your addressable lighting. As far as the Mystic Light software is concerned, there is a section along the top that shows icons for all of the attached compatible devices for you to click through, and then it lets you rotate back and forth through the different zones that you can light up independently, and then you can choose your colors and your patterns that you want to use. Now, while I was correct in my RTX 2070 video that the software does allow each individual zone of lighting to do its own thing, there are certain hard limitations in place, specifically for this graphics card, and that I can't have one zone be set to a steady color without the other zone being set to it as well. Ultimately, it's not a deal breaker with the software, but it is something to be mindful of, and it is something that you should still keep an eye on future patches and updates for, because that may get addressed in future iterations of this software. Now, as far as RGB Fusion is concerned, it largely has the same kind of functionality that Mystic Light has, just with a Gigabyte AORUS ecosystem instead. You have a home button that brings you to a base selection of all the attached compatible components that you can go in through RGB Fusion software and tune the lighting for. And depending on the connected device and its own limitations, it will have either more or less options for you to choose. Now, unlike Rosewill and Mystic Light, RGB Fusion must run at startup in order for the RGB lighting for your ecosystem to sync up and act the way you intend it to act. If you don't run the software at startup, not gonna do anything. It's a little disappointing because the only other control that you have with this ecosystem is through the motherboard BIOS, and it's basically just static single color configurations that you can access from within the BIOS. Now, that being said, after the software has started up and been running, you can then go through and close it if you want, and your RGB lighting effects should stay in place. However, there were older versions of this software where it didn't do that, and closing it would also cause my RGB lighting effects to go away. So again, your mileage may vary there. Now, one more thing I want to touch on real quick before I close out the video is lighting coordination, specifically as it pertains to the color white. If you're looking for all white lighting in your computer, that's going to be really tough to get to match entirely, and in some instances you may not be able to get it to match at all. For instance, this lighting configuration that I have right here, if I try to set everything to white, it looks like straight up dookie. A bunch of the lighting on the motherboard is just far too warm for its own good, like red just persists as an on color regardless of how much white you set. And even in trying to manually dial this into place, it just can't be done on the motherboard. Then the sections where the white does look decent, it then shifts more towards the blue spectrum. And then in turn, the white on the graphics card and the fans even looks a little different. So that's probably going to be the biggest pain in the butt for any of you out there. Any other color, the softwares independently, the MSI software and the Gigabyte software, give you the ability to type in specific color number codes to determine saturation on a scale of 0 to 255. This lets you really precisely dial in the specific color that you're looking for. But just remember, again, each individual component is going to have different color tuning for it. So the color code that I use for my MSI graphics card is actually a bit different from the color code that I'm outputting to my Antec Prism fans through the Gigabyte RGB Fusion software. It ultimately comes down to a little bit of trial and error, but the fact that these newer softwares offer that kind of granular control over lighting to get it dialed in properly is really nice. So I guess if I had any closing tips for you guys, it would probably be the following. First thing, double check to make sure you're plugging everything in correctly. If you plug a 12-volt device into a 5-volt header, odds are that's not going to do anything other than cause your lights to not power up. But if you flip that around and you accidentally plug in a 5-volt powered device into a 12-volt header, more than likely you'll wind up breaking the device. I actually have a video down in the description by BPS Customs in which he actually does this completely by mistake. So you guys can actually see for yourselves what that process looks like. Next thing, don't hesitate to go back and double check your motherboard manual or the instruction manual that came with your product. Chances are there's something that was in there that you missed, some step that was overlooked. It's really easy to do with some of these ecosystems, especially when you start getting into like the Corsair lighting system. There's module after cable with those systems. It's the functionality it gets you is really nice, but it's a nightmare, especially if you've never done this sort of thing before. And in rare instances, like mine with these Antec Prism fans, there could be information that was completely missing from the instruction manual. Which sort of leads me into the next tip. Don't hesitate to go to the manufacturer and ask. It may take them a minute to get back to you, but ultimately, even if the RGB lighting isn't working, odds are the product itself is still functioning just fine. Again, maybe there's something that they forgot to put in, like with these Antec fans, they forgot to mention in the manual that you have to hold the mode button for a few seconds on the control node in order for the lighting on these fans to sync up with the motherboard. Next step, if you're experiencing further problems, try disabling the software. I actually, every now and then, will have this really bizarre issue with these fans where 2 or 3 banks of the LEDs will get stuck on white, while the rest of the pattern is doing what the software is supposed to be telling it to do. It's almost always the exact same fan. And initially I thought, oh geez, something's got to be wrong with my fans. Like, is this going to be some stupid RMA just because the lighting is freaking out on me? Well, I went and tested this by switching back to the module controlled lighting configurations, and sure enough, the problem went away. Then on the instances where the problem would reappear, I would find that just doing a full shutdown and then restart the computer would correct the problem. So basically, just don't be afraid to try disabling certain bits of functionality just to try and test different things. Disable software, change some settings, re-enable software, maybe even move back to an older known good version of the software to see if the same behavior is repeating. Which then brings me to another tip. If you have to download separate software, make sure you're downloading the files physically from the website, from the vendor's website, rather than doing it through an auto update system. Not only because of the increased potential for malware to be installed on our systems, as we've seen recently with ASUS, but also it gives you a physical copy of an older version of the software. Sometimes the newer stuff winds up causing more problems than it solves. And until that bug gets corrected, it's best to just go back to a known good version of the software. And that's much more difficult to do if you're doing that update through an auto update system that doesn't leave that physical file for you. And lastly, even if an initial color configuration that you were hoping would look a certain way doesn't wind up turning out quite as you had hoped, remember, this is RGB lighting, and honestly that can be part of the fun of it, is playing around with things a little bit and trying out combinations that you never would have thought of before. I mean, I honestly came upon my own color configuration completely by accident, and I'm glad I did. And if it wasn't for RGB lighting, I wouldn't have been able to do that. And now, if you were thinking of taking the plunge into an RGB ecosystem yourself, hopefully you feel a little bit more confident and comfortable approaching that. And again, if you have any more questions on different steps that you should be taking, or maybe some specific problems that you're having, feel free to leave something for me in the comments down below. I can't guarantee that I'll get to everyone's message that goes down there, and I can't really even say that I'll have an immediate answer, but I'll definitely do what I can to help you guys out. Also, if you happen to be reading through the comments and you see a question that you can answer, throw your 2 cents in. Why not? Now, I know this video's style was a little bit different from what I usually do, so definitely make sure to hit the thumbs up button if you liked what you saw. Hit the subscribe button for more content coming at you every other Saturday, except for this video because I ran behind. My bad. Also, don't forget to follow me on Twitter and Instagram. I'm at the Manic Geek, and as always, I will catch you guys next time. So take it easy.